Hello, everyone. Hi. Welcome to the Northeast Georgia History Center's live stream program about the history of LGBTQ civil rights movements in the United States. I am Libba Beecham, the Director of Media and Communications here at the Northeast Georgia History Center, and we have historian and Executive Director Glenn Kyle here as well. And I want to thank you all for joining us. So today we are going to give you a broad view of the civil rights movements in the LGBT community in the United States. I think this will act as a really good introduction because there is so much to explore about the civil rights movements in the LGBTQ community in the U.S.
Would you say this is an overview in a nutshell?
You know what? That has become our catchphrase, and I do think that applies here. So this is going to certainly be in a nutshell, but I do hope that we can provide you with information that you were unaware of and get to know the people, the places, the movements, the protests, the events, the legal challenges and successes that have led us to where we are today. And please let us know if you have any questions throughout the presentation. You are welcome to ask a question, and we will have time for a Q&A later. Leslie is going to be helping us out with those questions, so thank you, Leslie. So let's start a little bit earlier. We're going to go to the early 20th century. So in the early 20th century, when I was doing my research, it really seemed that Germany was a place that was experiencing some rise in gay visibility. So that started with Karl Ulrichs. I hope I'm saying that. Ulrichs, yes. And he writes a collection of essays defending homosexuality. And this is pretty big stuff at the time. I mean, this is 1862. And Glenn, could you just sort of set the stage as to not only what's going on in Europe, but what's going on in 1862? What's going on in America, I wonder?
Well, in 1862, actually, one of the most significant events in American history, the creation of A1 steak sauce, but also the American Civil War.
Yes.
So there's lots of, and in Germany's this interesting place because Germany isn't even really Germany yet, right? Mm-hmm. It's pre-Union, and Germany has all these different cultures and all these different takes on things, very urban, very rural, and they're getting ready to come together and unify. And that, of course, sets Europe on a path of craziness. But like a lot of different things, it's a center of learning. There's lots of universities in Germany, and there's a lot of liberal thought in Germany. And when I say liberal in this context, I'm talking actual classical liberal, right? Like Enlightenment, founding of American states and things like that. A broad view of human rights.
Right. Which a little bit later, we do see that in a few different forms in the United States. Of course, there is the rise of women's suffrage that's happening. There's also African Americans that are gaining their rights and fighting for their rights. And someone in particular that I wanted to mention was a woman named Victoria Woodall, and she was actually she was the first woman to run for president, and her VP pick was Frederick Douglass. So she is part of this movement in an early sense because she was also part of the free love movement. And I have a quote from her from a daring speech that she made that was known as the Steinway speech that took place in Steinway Hall in New York City in 1871, where she defends her views of the free love movement by saying, "Yes, I am a free lover. I have an inalienable, constitutional, and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long or as short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please, and with that right, neither you nor any law you can frame have any right to interfere." So
pretty progressive,
pretty bold words. You can see a picture of her right there as well with her nice top hat. So there are people speaking out about different expressions of love. And then in 1897, there were also there were secret societies for the gay community. And the Order of, another one that I might not say correctly, Chironia, would you say?
Chironia.
Chironia. And this is a secret society in Germany that's founded by George Cecil Ives, who I also found out was a friend of Oscar Wilde, who was also important during this time because he was a well-known author, but he was also discriminated against for being gay. So then in 1897, something really influential happens. This is one of the first times that homosexuality is studied. So we have the Scientific Humanitarian Committee that's formed in Berlin by Magnus Hirsch, and you can see him in the corner there. And there were 25 of these local chapters doing research into human sexuality. And unfortunately, during the rise of the Nazis in 1933, so much of their research is just completely destroyed. You can see the image at the bottom there of this is over 20,000 books and journals, papers, images, and research that are destroyed. But nonetheless, this the Scientific Humanitarian Committee was a very influential part of the early LGBTQ movement. So let's move on a little bit further in history. So I wanted to address vaudeville theater because this is one of the first times we see what you might call cross-dressing that is acceptable when you are impersonating a woman or a man of the opposite, when you are the opposite sex. And one of the people that performed this way was Florence Tempest, and she was known as our American Boy. So she would dress as a man and sing love songs and entertain the audience with her impersonation of a man. And then we go on,
and it's important to note too that even by the 10s and the 20s, this cross dressing especially for entertainment purposes is considered, oh dear goodness me, but it's not totally something that causes people to be burned at the stake. No. Which is why Joan of the Arc was burned at the stake. Actually, one of the primary charges against her was dressing like a man.
Wow.
And that's one of the things that stuck in the trial that she was then condemned for. So just to give you context of what kind of danger could be represented by even just cross-dressing.
Yes, thank you. And of course, when it's seen through the perception of entertainment, there is a bit more that you can get away with. Now, I have not found any documentation as to how Florence Tempest identified herself. People were not very out at the time. So, but it's really interesting that this was a part of the American culture in the vaudeville circuits. And going on a little bit further in time, we have Ma Rainey. And she was a very influential blues singer from Columbus, Georgia. And she was known for dressing more masculine. And you can see in this newspaper article that she's in this masculine outfit. She's speaking to two women. And in the back there, you see that there is a cop watching her. And this song was called Prove It On Me Blues. And I have the lyrics up here because I was quite surprised at how explicit her message is. Talking about, I've highlighted the key lyrics, but went out last night, had a big fight, everything seemed to go on wrong. I looked up, to my surprise, the gal I was with was gone. Went out last night with a crowd of my friends. They must have been women because I don't like no men. It's true, I wear a collar and tie. She goes on, I went out last night with a crowd of my friends. Again, it must have been women because I don't like men. Wear my clothes just like a fan, talk to the gals just like any old man, 'cause they say I do it, ain't nobody caught me, sure got to prove it on me. So I found that to be just fascinating and quite a risk to take, but at the same time, she is a performer, so there's going to be a certain amount of a persona that she's putting on stage, which might have been some of the appeal of Ma Rainey and her sort of scandalous persona. So moving on.
Well, and you're talking about something that goes against the norms of the day, and the norms of the day are something that the young people always tend to want to do. That's part of what being young is
Yes.
rebelling against the norms of the day, whatever those norms may be. And listening to lyrics like this, that means they're gonna have a market, and they're gonna be people who want to publish it because it can be profitable, and it also gets a certain sort of rebellious message out there.
Yes, absolutely. And as we move on into the 20s up to the 50s, so I was interested in the Society for Human Rights. Now, this was a short-lived organization, but it was the first gay rights organization in the United States, founded by Henry Gerber, and this is in 1924. So we learned a little bit about the context of sort of the turn of the century, but what's going on in the 20s? I mean, we in America and of course the world, we have had a war, we've had a pandemic,
right?
and we always a lot of us think of the 1920s as just this big party.
It's the Roaring 20s,
it's
right?
The Roaring 20s,
and you know, again, generally speaking, it depends upon what part of society you're in. In rural areas, things are going to be a little bit more conservative because there are not places to go to. In the urban areas, it's going to be very, very different. You've got a lot of society just wanting to let loose after having made it through the war and the Spanish flu pandemic. And people, you know, there's new types of music coming on, influenced very heavily by African Americans. You've got jazz coming on. You have just a lot of prosperity going on, which ironically also, you know, sort of eventually causes a conservative kickback in society with Warren G. Harding and folks like that. But this is a very free and open time, not just in the United States, but in Europe too. I mean, you know, we were talking about Germany and about the things going on in Berlin and places like that. It is I'll say like a Babylon, because that's what's popped in my head. If you haven't seen this Netflix series called Babylon Berlin that really looks at Berlin in this time period, there's crazy stuff going on with cabarets and songs and a lot of entertainment base that's allowing a lot of expression for things that are not considered what might happen in conservative, polite society.
Yeah.
So, and it's the same in the United States too.
Sure. And so I learned that Henry Gerber served in World War I and was stationed in Germany. So he was there during a time when he could experience a bit more freedom as a gay man. So he comes back to the United States and he founds the Society for Human Rights. And this is a pretty short-lived organization because it goes against quite a lot of moral codes of the time. And perhaps you could speak to exactly what is a moral code? A
moral code is and a lot of these were actually statutes. It's not just something, you know, that's considered in society the way to behave. A lot of them are actual law statutes. That's how you get sodomy laws. There are laws against dressing like the opposite sex in certain municipalities and in certain states and things like that. There are laws put on the books, and they can be enforced. And when they're enforced, it's almost always to suppress what is seen as not responsible illicit behavior, especially homosexual behavior at the time. And so these people who are trying to create these societies are doing so in a very brave kind of way, because they're literally flaunting the law in a lot of the places where they live.
And so Henry Gerber, as part of the Society for Human Rights, he does attempt to create a periodical called Freedom and Friendship. And much of what the Society for Human Rights, much of their ideals were very American in a sense when it comes to the pursuit of happiness. And he did say that law and order was certainly a part, but not when it discriminates against the private lives of individuals. Right. So with the attempt to have this periodical and very try to get subscribers, it was very difficult. Not a lot of people were willing to risk being outed by a subscription to a magazine like Friendship and Freedom. And eventually Henry Gerber's home is raided by the police, and a lot of his materials are destroyed. I learned that through the court fees that he faced. He actually goes into bankruptcy, but this does not stop him. He does continue to write for magazines up through the 40s, at least, maybe the 50s. A bit more subtle in his messaging, but he is still writing to fight for the ideals that he believes in. So then we sort of jump after World War II. So we're in 1945, and I found out that there were a group of gay veterans who formed the Veterans Benevolent Society in New York City. So we're seeing the beginnings of more organization that does stick around a bit longer. And then we have a very influential society called the Mattachine Society, and it begins in 1950. And it is another organization to defend the rights of gay men in particular. And with the Mattachine Society, their goal was to tell the heterosexual community that, hey, we are just like you. We are just everyday people. And so they did take a bit more of, you could say, a bit more of a conservative stance, and you'll see why as we progress a bit later, when the Mattachine Society is still around in the 60s and 70s. Yeah. So there are some challenges and differences in opinion a little bit later, but the Mattachine Society is a very important group for gay men in 1950. And if you see up there, their, I guess, mascot is a jester. And this is an allusion to a commedia dell'arte, Italian comedy in which there is a jester character who is speaking the truth through subversive jokes. So to the king,
a classic theme of jesters through medieval period.
Yes.
and Renaissance history. Yeah.
Yes. So you can see that, this is not a society where it's still a bit subtle. It's called the Mattachine Society. It's not the, gay rights society. There's not anything explicitly like gay in the title. So they're still being a bit more subtle. And then on to 1952, we have a publication that does last for quite a while. One Inc. is the group that starts One Magazine, which we'll get to a little bit later. And this is formed by members of a local Mattachine society. So we can see that there's organizations, and then members of those organizations are making their own organizations. So it's slowly growing. And One Inc. is interesting because that's an organization that is comprised of both gay and lesbians. And in 1955, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, they create another a bit more subtle organization called the Daughters of Bilitis. And this is the very first lesbian civil rights organization in the United States. And you can see the couple that started it over there right above the Daughters of Bilitis photo there. And you can see the picture of One Inc. and its founder, Jim Kepner, standing by the door as well. So moving on a bit further in history. So then we do have, even though Henry Gerber did not have success in 1924 of getting his periodical to be subscribed to, there was LGBTQ literature. And one of the really important novels of the 20s was by a British author named Radcliffe Hall, and she publishes a novel called The Well of Loneliness, and this is often referred to earlier in the gay community. It's a love story of two women who face discrimination for their relationship, so it's very much a real romantic love story. It's not like an explicit pulp fiction, which was available,
right?
But this is really finally, a story, a love story of two women, and it does who face discrimination but still attempt to overcome it. So this is a very influential book, especially for the lesbian community, and it gives rise to more authors like that of Lisa Ben, which is a pseudonym, and she's going for a play on the word lesbian with Lisa Ben. And I was fascinated to learn of this story. So Lisa Ben is a secretary at a studio in Los Angeles, and her boss tells her, you know, I want you to look busy so I look more important. So I don't care what you're typing, just always look busy. So she follows the orders, and she decides to write one of the very early lesbian magazines called Vice Versa. And when I was listening to an oral history of this, I mean, she was very just practical about it. She was, you know, I've got this time on my hands, I've got these thoughts in my head. And so what she would do is she would have to have, she would publish it with just carbon copy paper. So she would type it, it'd be, she'd have to type several copies of it. And and then dish out these carbon copies to very much in just you know, her circles, and then they would hand it off to someone else, and I almost want to say and vice versa. So and then she goes on later to write for the Ladder. But before we get to the Ladder, in 1953, One Inc., the group that we were talking about earlier, does publish a very popular magazine called One, and this is one of the pro-gay magazines that gets the most attention, and it's also recognized by its art and the cover designs, which were designed by a lesbian woman named Joan Corbin. And so we go on to the Daughters of Bilitis, who published The Ladder, which is a monthly magazine for lesbians. And The Ladder is, the title is referencing the well of loneliness, because they are saying that this is the ladder out of the well of loneliness for women. In 1967, a little bit later, we have our first, gay bookshop. So this is specifically literature for and about the LGBT community, the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop in New York City. So we do see that through the 40s and 50s, and then a little bit later into the 60s, literature and magazines, in particular periodicals, are being created. And while just like Vice Versa was a locally written, very independently produced magazine, I know that there are a lot of other works similar to that were made by local gay community members. So there's a lot to dive into with LGBTQ literature. I think we could really dive into a presentation on just the literature at the time.
And I think it's important to contextualize too that this is how they got the word out. This is how they organized. This is nowadays, if we want to do something, we go on Facebook and we start a group and we invite all of our friends, and soon it's got 20,000 people in it. This takes a lot more work. Yes. Like you said, she's typing out the copies of her book almost literally one at a time. Yeah. And so this type of organization takes a lot of effort and a lot of spirit to get it done. And I think, you know, that speaks to how important being able to share these thoughts, these ideas, these stories with folks who it's going to reach a sympathetic ear with. It's really a grassroots important type of movement that's hard to imagine today.
Absolutely. And you know, the types of media that you could find in these magazines, they would include poetry, short stories, opinion pieces, articles. They would include information about the organizations that you can join, especially since many of them were published by organizations and were a way to give their organization a real voice. So very influenced by art as well, and creative writing. So we get to the big event, the Stonewall uprising. So if you're not super familiar with gay history, then there's sometimes people think that this is where it began, the Stonewall uprising, and in a sense, this is where it really just exploded. I mean,
that's where it entered the public stage.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
So, you know, we have these societies, we have LGBTQ people meeting in secret, meeting at their homes, forming clubs. I learned, for instance, there was a motorcycle club, so you could get away and actually just be able to express yourself without the risk of being in an urban environment. So, all of this is taking place before Stonewall. There is a lot of organization. There is a fair amount of communication, but it's all within the LGBTQ community. And with Stonewall, this is really when this sparks the Gay Liberation Front. So what is Stonewall? So the Stonewall Inn is a gay bar that is in the Greenwich Village of New York. And in 1969, on June 28th, coming up on the anniversary, there is a police raid. And these police raids were fairly common. They happened quite a bit. According to the oral histories and the research that I've done, the Stonewall Inn was run by mafia members, so which was probably not all that unusual during this time. So there would be raids. But these raids would oftentimes lead to a lot of LGBTQ people being arrested for these obscenity charges, for dressing as the opposite sex, according to the police. So it often was the case that the LGBTQ community was the one facing a lot of discrimination in these raids, where this was a space where people could come together and find community, find entertainment for themselves, just be. So to have the police raids becoming more and more frequent, there was some agitation already set in. So when on this particular night, it really wasn't all that different of a police raid, but according to the oral histories that we have, and I'll keep referring to that because there really isn't a huge amount of primary source documentation other than these oral histories. And
it's a riot and a social movement. They didn't document it in their diary minute by minute as they were doing it. A lot of movements like this, it's hard to find, like you're talking about.
Yes.
Traditional primary sources.
So there are going to be folks that were, this grew to 500 to 600 people that were participating and witnessing this. So, you have different vantage points. You have, of course, different memories over time. So, but what we do know is that there was, when things got a bit violent, I know that according to the oral histories, that there was a woman who was injured somehow, and this may have been because of the police. It was certainly not uncommon of an experience to be hurt during these riots, whether it was by police or fellow rioters. And because this was at a time when people are getting pretty fed up, that person being injured then led to other people getting angry about that, and that just escalated very quickly from that person's injury. There were people who were being lined up to get in the paddy wagon and go to jail, literally. So they were frustrated and really angry, and it started out with the first bit of action that they took this night was throwing change at the police. First, it starts with throwing pennies and then quarters and dimes and everything, and they're throwing their change as a symbol of what they saw as the police coming to. When there was a raid, they said that the police would get a payoff from the mafia, so that was their understanding. So they would basically throw this change to say, "Oh, you want our money? Have it," And so it escalates from there to there are broken windows. There is not a lot of police on site. They really did not expect this to happen. Usually people comply, and this was not the case that night. So a task force, a more militarized force of the police, come in to try and I say keep the peace, but it was pretty,
get control,
really, yes. But more and more people start gathering because in Greenwich Village, this was the gay community. So then This turns into 6 nights of protest and civil unrest. And there's a lot of media coverage about it, much of which is quite disparaging of the LGBTQ community. And this unrest gives rise to a much more public form of protest and demonstrations and organizations through what is called the Gay Liberation Front. So immediately after the Stonewall uprising, leaders in the gay community, such as we have Marsha P. Johnson at the bottom there. She was a very well-known woman in the LGBT community. We also have Sylvia Rivera that's pictured there with her kitty cat. And these were people who were very well-known in the village at the time and were very influential in getting people together and organized and activated, so to speak. So immediately after Stonewall, the Greenwich Village LGBTQ community gets together, and from those meetings and organization comes the Gay Liberation Front. And there are other groups that are also formed because people are excited to organize now. They are ready to be public. And there is, as we had alluded to before, there is controversy about that. Mm-hmm. Organizations like the Daughters of Bilitis and especially the Mattachine Society, they do not think that this is the best way forward. They have, from their point of view, they have been working to tell the rest of the world, we're just like you. And now at the Stonewall uprising, and from that we have demonstrations of like a chorus line of drag queens, right. So it's, kicking their heels to demonstrate, that this is who we are. So there are controversies, but overwhelmingly people in the LGBT community at this time, especially those who were there at the Stonewall uprising, are ready to come out, ready to organize in a more visible way. There's a really great quote from one of the witnesses and patrons of the Stonewall Inn. Michael Fader said, "Everyone in the crowd felt that we were never going to go back. It was like the last straw. It was the time to reclaim something that had always been taken from us." So it just gives a bit of insight to how folks were feeling at the time. So then we go on to more protests and demonstrations by what's known as the Gay Liberation Front. And the Gay Liberation Front is not just one single entity. These are lots of organizations coming together, and it's more of a movement. So of course, in 1969, this happened, that it becomes the Gay Liberation Front right after the Stonewall uprising. And then a few interesting events happen, and one of them was called the Friday of the Purple Hand. Now, this happens in San Francisco, and 60 members of the Gay Liberation Front are peacefully protesting disparaging articles against the LGBTQ people by the Examiner, and employees of the Examiner poured a barrel of ink from a window onto the protesters, and they really didn't know what they were doing, because those protesters then took the ink on their hands and went throughout downtown San Francisco using that ink to put their hands on the walls to really kind of say, like, take ownership, of their community, and writing messages with this ink. And that became known as, that's why it became known as Friday of the Purple Hand. I thought that was very interesting. And then in 1970, lesbian members of the Gay Liberation Front create a movement called the Lavender Menace. Now, this is also, the 60s and 70s. This is a time of the feminist movement as well, and the women's liberation movement. And there were controversies within the women's liberation movement and the feminist movement when it came to lesbian experiences and lesbian problems and advocating for the lesbian community. So I knew that they became known as, lesbians became known as the Lavender Menace to those who disagreed with them being a part of the women's lib movement. I couldn't quite find out exactly where that lavender term comes from. I need to do a little bit more research. If anybody in the chat knows, let us know. But regardless, they like many terms that are formally this, derogatory, they take ownership of it, and they call themselves the Lavender Menace, and they are protesting that exclusion of lesbian women in the feminist movement. And similarly, in 1970, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, those really well-known leaders within the Greenwich Village community, they start the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries group. And of course, speaking of language evolving, the word transvestite was not a derogatory term during this time within the community. So they, oh yes.
Shannon wanted you to know it was Betty Friedan.
Betty Friedan, who started the Lavender Menace. Oh, thank you.
Okay.
And who was that?
Shannon.
Thanks, Shannon.
Okay.
So Betty Friedman, thank you so much. So we see more and more organizations, and we see them become a bit more niche in a way. So they're finding their own community within their community. So people like Marsha and Sylvia create these organizations, and the STAR program was created specifically to provide housing and support gay youth and sex workers at the time. So this was all a community effort to support individuals who did not have the resources that they need. Often, of course, queer youth are going to be ostracized by family and perhaps put out on the streets. So this was a way that they were able to give them resources.
These are very marginalized people.
Yes, extremely marginalized folks. So for them to organize and be very public about who they are is really extraordinary. So, of course, thanks to the Stonewall uprising, thanks to the Gay Liberation Front, we have so many more organizations. I could not possibly list them all. I really had to pick and choose. So what I did was I wanted to pick some organizations that represented the diversity of these types of organizations. In the 70s, we then see parents and friends and allies coming to support their gay community members. So we have Jean Manford forms a support group, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, which is called PFLAG, and that still exists in New York City to support her son who is gay. And then in 1973, we also have the formation of the National Gay Task Force, which brings together queer activists and religious leaders, scientists, and legal experts to advocate for the rights of lesbian people. So we're also seeing more people that like religious leaders in particular, scientists in particular, coming to support the LGBT community, because these were often the case going to be people who you would not see as necessarily an ally for a long time up to this point. And speaking of scientists, this was also really important to have the support of scientists and psychologists, because for so long, LGBTQ people were seen as sick or somehow psychologically deficient. So to have scientists and psychologists and doctors advocate for the rights, and there was a very important study in the 70s that it was actually it was finally they removed.
In 73, the American Psychiatric Association votes 13-0 to remove homosexuality from its list of psychoses.
Yes. So that's,
I'm sorry, psychiatric disorders.
Yes, so that's huge. And then we go on in 1974, we have the Combahee River Collective. And I thought this was an interesting connection to history, because they call themselves the Combahee River Collective because...
Well, they're on the Combahee River in South Carolina, I believe.
Well, yes, and who led a raid on
Oh,
the
that's
Combahee
right,
River.
Harriet Tubman.
Yes. So, Harriet Tubman during the Civil War led a raid on the Combahee River as part of her to free slaves in that area. So they're drawing on that sense of abolition and civil rights, and so they form a group of Black lesbians to advocate for Black women's rights. So then we go on. We also have more minorities being represented. So the Gay American Indians organization is founded in San Francisco. We go on to have gay and lesbian advocates and defenders. So now there are lawyers and legal defenses that are helping queer people with legal resources as well. And then we also have the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays. And of course, so all of these organizations are forming during the 70s. This is really a time of lots and lots of activism, lots of energy, and a lot of people taking pretty big risks. Not only are they risking the fact that they're risking their job opportunities, they are risking their relationships with their family who may not understand, and they're taking a risk by going to these protests and demonstrations where you really never knew if it was going to be violent or not. So the 70s was really quite a big time for the Gay Liberation Front. And of course, that brings rise to more literature. So we have the Come Out magazine, which is the publication of the GFL, and I'm sorry, the Gay Liberation Front. I did a little typo, the GLF. So, and that's in 1969. So that's coming right after Stonewall uprising. So we have another magazine, and this one with a call to action: come out. So, and it's a newspaper by and for the gay community. So then in 1974, there's also a magazine that is specifically for rural gay communities. So these are certainly underrepresented, as a lot of the activism is taking place in bigger cities, more urban environments. But we start to see rural communities start to be represented, like through the magazine, like the Running Water Commune. And this commune was an actual commune. I forget what state it was in, but it was basically a safe haven, a community of fellow LGBTQ people in a rural community. We also have Audre Lorde, very influential author. She publishes Cole, which is a collection of poetry about life as a Black lesbian and mother. So really speaking to the experiences of Black women, but not only Black women and Black mothers, Black lesbians. And that's very important. And that goes on to, we go on to have the Gay American History, which is the very first book to document gay history in the United States. And then in 1977, the Combahee River Collective has a very influential statement. They publish a series of essays that outline their views and goals. And since they were specifically for Black lesbian members, this was quite a big deal. So we see lots of more people being more out about their queerness and getting the communication to more and more people on a national level. So then as we go into the later 70s, we have much more visible activism, and we also have political activism as well. Elaine Noble, which you see right there at the left-hand corner, becomes the first openly gay person to be elected as a state legislator. In 1977, there is a well-known, a very large boycott by queer activists of the Florida Citrus Commission, and that is because their spokeswoman was a woman named Anita Hill, who led work toward preventing a discrimination law, repealing an ordinance that prevented discrimination against LGBTQ people. So they felt that a way to show their outrage at this was to boycott the Florida Citrus Commission. She is eventually let go from that position. And this is also connected with Harvey Milk, which I'm sure because of the movie Milk, a lot of people are at least a little bit familiar with Harvey Milk. And he is elected the county supervisor in San Francisco, which has a huge gay community and a very active gay community, and becomes the third out elected public official in the United States. And so we're feeling some political successes at this time. And then in 1978, the Pride rainbow flag that a lot of us are familiar with is designed by Gilbert Baker and is flown during the Gay Freedom Parade for the first time. And you can see the flag that's represented there is that flag. And then we go on to a bit more disturbing news. We have Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone, I assume.
Mm-hmm.
They're assassinated by a fellow employee, Dan White. I'll have to do a bit more research into this. I did read that it might not have been the case that this was specifically about Harvey Milk being gay. It seemed to also be driven by severe depression and jealousy of wanting to have a position.
Yeah.
So I think that's a program that we could really focus on at another time. But the death of Harvey Milk is of course devastating to the gay community, especially in San Francisco. And this sparks what were called the White Night Riots after the what was viewed as the lenient sentencing of Dan White. The folks took to the streets and rioted because they felt that I believe he was sentenced to 7 years and he was only in there for 5 years, I believe. But the gay community did not feel that this was just, and thus riots took place in San Francisco. Now, one of the largest marches for gay rights was the National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights, and that happens in 1979. So just in the time frame that we're just speaking about, when everyone is way more organized, way more activated, and over 100,000 people participate in the National March. And through those marches, they're also conducting workshops, they have events, they're displaying gay art and music and talking about strategy. So they're really trying to activate even more people during this time.
And again, to create a wider national sense of community. I mean, it's a march, but from what I've read about that event, it's almost a citywide festival too.
Right,
I mean,
yes.
right? Like you say, there are art booths and there are concerts and lots of different things that create a sense of belonging and relationships, and that's always a key factor when you're trying to make something like this work. And again, I keep harping on this. This is before the interwebs,
Yes.
right? This is before you could just automatically link up with folks. Something like this is going to be a huge matter in being able to organize and keep the movement moving forward.
Yes, and marches were a very popular way to demonstrate. In fact, the next year after the Stonewall uprising is the beginning of what we today would call the Pride March. But then it was to commemorate the Stonewall uprising. And I believe it was called the Christopher Street Freedom March. I know that it had Christopher Street in there, but this is essentially the beginning of what we know as a Pride March. So it starts out as to commemorate the Stonewall uprising. The further we go into the future, it becomes more about pride. And I think that the word pride is something that is really central to this entire era of the Gay Liberation Front, because to have pride in your being gay was certainly that means you are out. That means you are proud enough of yourself and believe in that you should be out, so you should have pride in yourself. And so there's really this different philosophy, different ethos that's happening through these marches, and this national march was certainly a way for a lot of people to say we have pride in our community. We go on to even more societies and organizations. And of course, throughout the 80s, the gay community is overwhelmed by the AIDS crisis. And of course, this affects many, many people, and not just the gay community, of course. And it also affects their family and friends. So we not only see more broader outreach, such as the services and advocacy for LGBT elders, known as SAGE. So we're also seeing organizations for older adults. We're seeing organizations for bisexual people. So that's a term that's coming more into use and being more recognized. And we have the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, or GLAD, which is known for their work in media portrayals and media and how gay people are represented in the media. And then ACT UP is a very, very important group when it comes to the AIDS crisis. So they are known as the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, ACT UP. They're created and they're advocating for people who are living with AIDS. And as you see at the corner down there, they used the pink triangle as one of their symbols because they're referencing the pink triangle during the Holocaust, when gay men would have to wear that pink triangle to signify that they were homosexual. And of course, I do believe the number was around 100,000 gay men were killed during the Holocaust. So it's sort of referencing that time when so many had died. And one of their mottos or slogans was that silence equals death. So they were very, the gay community was upset that AIDS was not getting the research that it needed, the medical resources for the gay community. They were not satisfied with that. So there are a lot of organizations that fight for those rights to the medical care and the resources that the people suffering with AIDS need. We also have, now approaching the 90s, the Gay and Lesbian Victory Fund, which still exists today. Now it's the LGBTQ Victory Fund. And this is one of the early political action committees that is created. And this is all with the goal to increase more representation by electing LGBTQ public officials. All right, as we move on into the 90s and the early 2000s, we see more visibility in schools. So we have the National Youth Advocacy Coalition. We now have younger folks who are, unlike the people before them, they can come out at an earlier age. They have more resources. They have more terminology to understand what are these feelings. And then we also have the Gay Straight Alliance Network, which is also in schools still today, and it's founded to assist students in creating a Gay Straight Alliance club in their schools. We also have Pride at Work, so more discussions about equal treatment in the workplace are happening in the 90s. So we have the Pride at Work organization, which is founded by LGBTQ labor union activists, and that is all in building a more tolerant and supportive work environment for gay individuals. We also see in 2003 the National Black Justice Coalition. We have the National Center for Transgender Equality. So we have representation for transgender people. We have organizations of other minorities like the El or La Para Translatinas for the Latinx community. And by 2009, we have Equality Across America, which begins to organize the National Equality March in Washington, D.C. So we're still having these marches, we're still organizing, and these are leading to more and more niche groups and more national groups and more local groups as well, from clubs and schools to these national equality marches.
It seems like a lot of groups, but you have to remember that that's actually very American. Rather than having one grand,
that's true,
we are the group, there's like hundreds at a local level, but that kind of means that they're more valuable to the folks that they're closer to geographically. And
they know the issues of their specific community. I mean, this is still a time when, people are not as transient and just moving all over the place, So it does make sense that a lot of local chapters and local organizations are formed as well during this time. Now, because of all of this organization, all of this activism, there are legal challenges and successes that come through. So in 1958, One Magazine and One Inc., the group we had discussed earlier, We have the One Inc. versus Olison. The Supreme Court reverses a lower court's decision that had found the publication to be obscene. So we talk about those obscenity laws.
Right.
That is finally that's reversed for one magazine. In 1973, we have an organization called Lambda Legal. You can see their logo up there, and they're the first legal organization to fight for the rights, for equal rights of gays and lesbians. In 1982, Wisconsin becomes the first state to outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation. And then in the 90s, we have Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which I personally see as a sort of stepping stone.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a lot of what the 90s presents for the gay community, is a stepping stone towards equality. And when we see something like Don't Ask, Don't Tell, this is a law that's signed into law by President Bill Clinton at the time, that does allow gay and lesbian people to serve in the military, but they remove questions about sexual orientation from the enlistment screening. And of course, it is expected that gay and lesbian people cannot serve out and openly in the military, hence Don't Ask, Don't Tell. In 1995, we have the Hate Crime Sentencing Enhancement Act that goes into effect, and that's part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. So this is including LGBTQ people in expanding what is a hate crime, so that there can be more harsher sentencing for something that can be deemed as a hate crime against a gay person. In 1996, Hawaii becomes the first state to recognize that gay and lesbian couples are entitled by the Constitution to the same privileges as heterosexual married couples. So we are seeing those stepping stones toward marriage equality, which becomes a large focus of the 90s and the early 2000s in the gay community. So then we go on to 2003, when the U.S. Supreme Court does strike down a law in which homosexual conduct is criminalized. So it now decriminalizes same-sex sexual conduct. In 2004, we have the first legal same-sex marriage in the United States, and that took place in Massachusetts. And you can see the picture up there between Marcia Kaddish and Tanya McCluskey. In 2009, Hate Crimes Prevention Act is passed, and that's a federal law against crimes directed at queer people. In 2010, we have the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell by President Barack Obama, and that allows queer people to finally serve openly in the military. By 2013, the Supreme Court does rule that defining marriage as just between a man and a woman is unconstitutional. And in 2015, the Supreme Court votes that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples. And extremely recently, we had in 2020, two or 3 weeks ago,
yeah.
we had the Supreme Court rule that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 does indeed protect LGBTQ employees from discrimination based on sex. So that is quite a lot of organization, quite a lot of activism, and of course, successes and stepping stones to where we are today. So at this time, we would love to take your questions, and I'll make us a little bit bigger, so okay. We don't look so tiny anymore. But we will do our best to answer any questions you may have. I've been doing lots and lots of research. Glenn is a historian, but neither one of us can claim expertise in all things gay history, but we will do our best. So, Leslie, do you have anything for us?
Could you speak a bit to what things were like for the LGBTQ community in Georgia in the 60s and 70s?
Oh, okay.
And when do Georgia-based LGBTQ organizations end?
Okay, so the question was talking about specifically what was life like for the LGBT community in Georgia. Mm-hmm. That I can only assume that there were similar experiences there were certainly the societies that we've talked about, like the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis. These become national organizations. I don't know when they would have had chapters in Georgia or in the southern states in general. But I do know that they did exist, and that especially in the 50s and 60s, I would expect that, given that Georgia is a typically more conservative state, that they would probably gravitate towards those groups that were a bit more subtle, that you could be a part of a society but not be out yet in the 1960s.
And a lot of this too, and I'm going to have to speak to a little bit of a universal approach rather than Georgia, because I have not done the research on that for the 60s and 70s. But a lot of how you're able to function in society and how you're able to work is based on your socioeconomic status as well. Because I know that, you know, if you're a gay person and you are in a more wealthy family, if you're well off, the circles you run in are more tolerant. Maybe, I don't know if tolerance is the right word, but they sort of recognize that there's something a little different. They may not get married, but because they're in the same socioeconomic class, there's a little bit more, not tolerance, I guess turn a blind eye is really the description. And, you know, I've read a couple of accounts of people speaking of a wealthy, eccentric friend who lived across town who was a little light in the loafers, they would say. and so it was, you would still carry on business, you would still go to social clubs. Whereas on the other end of the socioeconomic scale, those who are marginalized, you know, economically and in a lot of different ways, they're going to have a much harder time gaining access to tolerance, or even having their socioeconomic peers turn a blind eye, because there's too much struggle involved with the economic factors that some of these social factors don't come into play. So again, it's sort of, I guess to answer your question, it sort of depends upon where exactly you are already at in society as to how your particular subgroup is going to operate, given your given whether you're LGBT or not.
Right. And you know, from the oral histories that I have listened to, which I do have resources at the end for you to check out, it really was quite obvious to me that sometimes you got pretty lucky with a family that was willing to listen, willing to understand, or at least accept you. I recall a story from the podcast Making Gay History, in which there was a young black boy who came out to his father and mother, and they took him to a doctor. Basically, this is in the 50s, and just say, what do we do? What can we do? And the doctor had said, well, you know, technically I'm supposed to they could either go to a mental ward or take them to jail, because
that's the best place for people that need help, is jail.
Yes. But so they take their child home. They don't want that for them. So what they decide to do is they tell their son that, you know, we want you to meet someone that you can trust, and when you meet that person, bring them to live with us so that you'll be safe and that you can have the relationship that you want. And I just thought that was just, I mean, really, I had never expected.
And when was this?
This was in the 50s.
Okay.
So, and maybe even a little bit earlier. I have to check. It's in the Making Gay History podcast. So I definitely recommend listening to that. We'll get to more resources then, but it just reminded me that, you know, it really just depended, like you said, on so many different circumstances, what your experience as a gay individual was going to be during a time like the 50s and 60s. Yeah.
Can you recommend where to get all of this information?
Ah, yes, I certainly can recommend where to get all of this information. Let me go to my resources slide. Let's see. So I will make us invisible for a second so you can see all these awesome resources. So here we go. Let's get us out of the way.
We're going away.
Bye. Okay, so the first one that I think a great start to learning about LGBTQ history is listening to the Making Gay History podcast. And this is a series of oral history interviews by Eric Marcus. This is from the 80s, and these are interviews with all kinds of people. I mean, not just well-known folks, but just your everyday activists and people who were in the gay community. So I really recommend Making Gay History. Excellent podcast. Queer Design is a really great look at all of the art that was created. Many of the images that I've presented today you can find in Queer Design by Andy Campbell, who is not only an art historian, but a museum curator. So I felt a particular draw to that book and how they show LGBTQ history through the medium of art and design. If you are a teacher out there, there's some really great resources. History Unerased Classroom is a really great resource if you're looking for ways that you can teach about LGBTQ history in your classroom or at home. We also have books like A Queer History of the United States by Michael Bronsky, and that goes very much in depth and starts kind of at the same time that we started timeline-wise. So you can really go in depth with that. And then we have, Transgender History, The Roots of Today's Revolution by Susan Stryker. And so you get a more focused view of the transgender story. And then I also recommend LGBTQhistory.org, where there are tons and tons of resources. This is a website managed by the Our Family Coalition, which supports families with LGBTQ members. So these are all excellent go-to resources, but there are so many more. And if you have any that you would like to recommend to us, I would really appreciate it if you would put those in the chat so everyone else can see as well. But we'll go back to our question slide for now. What other... we are going a little bit over time, if that's okay with you. I'm fine with that if it's cool with y'all.
Right.
So what other questions do we have?
Since there is so much information out there that people may not be aware of, will you consider doing more programs on this?
Oh, yes. So doing more programs on this. Yes, absolutely. I would love to do that. We're certainly focused on sharing a diverse array of history, as history is so complex and so layered, and there's so much that we can talk about. So I would love to dive into that.
And if you don't mind, just for a second, tell them a little bit about the oral history
Oh,
project.
yes, absolutely. So something that we did last year, and I'll make us... make us small again. Yeah. It's kind of fun. So let me put us there, and then we go here. So last year I had the honor of interviewing...
Oh, you already had a slide?
Yeah.
What a great setup.
I know, right? I had the honor of interviewing individuals in Northeast Georgia of the LGBTQ community, and we are a very small staff here. So while we have all of this awesome interview footage, we were really looking for an intern, volunteer intern that has video editing experience, and this can be anyone in the U.S. Anyone really, because it's digital. But we have these really awesome interviews that are in our archives from various perspectives of the queer community in Northeast Georgia that we want to present as part of our digital archives, sort of a project that will. Is always going to be in the works, but we would love to present these interviews to the public one day, as well as the other oral history interviews that we have. We have quite a diverse group of interviewees. So if you're at all interested, please email us at historycenter@Brenau.edu, and we'll take the conversation from there. But I have to say that hearing the perspectives of all of these folks during the interview, it really... I was met with a lot of nostalgia and emotions about Northeast Georgia in particular. I mean, there were some challenging emotions of folks who had experienced discrimination either at work or by their family, but there were also people who were so influenced by their time in Northeast Georgia, and whether they stayed here or not, they are citizens of that community, and they represent the experience of Northeast Georgia queerness. So I can't wait to share that, but we do need some help. So if you are at all interested or know someone that might be interested, please send them my way.
Yes, because she's not exaggerating. You're looking at a third of our staff Actually, right now, just about.
Yeah.
So-
We're small, but we do a whole lot. So let's take a few more questions. I know that this was a lot of information, and I do apologize if we do not get to your question today.
What are the most prominent LGBTQ plus groups today?
So prominent LGBTQ plus groups today. Well, a lot of them are similar groups. So, for instance, PFLAG is still a group that's active today. I'm going to try to go back to our organizations. I know that in Georgia, for anyone who's in Georgia, there's a really great organization called Southern Fried Queer Pride, and they host a lot of great organizing events. They offer tons of resources. They do phenomenal performances and art galleries, and they're in Atlanta. There's, of course, still the Human Rights Campaign that is more on the legal side of activism. And so let me find those. I can sort of speak to which organizations. Many of them are still around. I know that ACT UP is still very active in advocating for people living with AIDS and HIV. The Mattachine Society, I do not know. So, I feel like most of my research this go around was for kind of like the 50s through the 80s. So I know
formative
that
years. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I know that there are tons of organizations, and many of them that we've talked about today still exist. In fact, I tried to pick ones that were listed as still active. So as we go through these, you can pretty much assume that some version of these groups are still around.
And the focus tends to shift. Most social movements, the civil rights movement of the 60s that included LGBTQ, but also African Americans, there are three basic types of groups in social movements. There are the groups that are service support and resources for that group. There are groups that advocate to people who are not of that group, sort of as a public face and to change society's views of that group. And then there are organizations that legally advocate, that try to make actual changes at the local, state, and national levels through legal change, through court cases and things like that. And so it takes all three of those kinds of groups to make those changes, which is another reason that there are a lot of them. But a lot of these advances by this community have come, as they did from the African American civil rights movement, through legal efforts, through changes. And like One Inc. versus Olson, that goes all the way back to the founding of the country. That's a First Amendment case. That was found in favor of One Inc. because of the First Amendment. Almost all of these other changes that you see, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and Obergefell versus, I can't remember, Hodges, that's a 14th Amendment case, right? That's equal protection under the law. These amendments, the Constitution, that espouses fundamental human rights, and I think that's kind of the poetic part, something that espouses fundamental human rights are the ones that we continue to go back to secure fundamental human rights. Right. And they're there. And they work eventually.
Yes. But in those, let me show you the resource slide again, because there are, if you go to, let's see, resources, where are you? Whoops. If you go to lgbthistory.org, you will also, I'm having a hard time finding it, sorry. But if you go to lgbtqhistory.org, you'll also find a ton of resources on active organizations, legal defense teams as well. I mean, all sorts of resources. So that's a really great place to check out. I'll try to answer a few more questions. Okay, two more. Sounds good.
Why do you think trans individuals have historically received biased treatment within our community?
So the question is, why do we think that trans individuals in particular have received bias in our community? Well, I think that goes back to, when we talked about societies like the Mattachine Society, that was more for gay men. And then you had the Daughters of Bilitis, which was for gay women. So these are people who are identifying as men and women, and their gender matches the one that they were assigned to at birth. So there's still this sort of traditional elements of that. I mean, these are still people who, in a large sense, did not want to be out of the norm. You know, they wanted to be perceived as normal. So for men to at the time, what they would perceive as men cross-dressing would seem to go against even their own ideals of, well, you're hurting our fight because we want to appear normal.
Right.
So,
and that's obviously not normal like we are.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's still these perspectives, even in the gay community, that are really challenges for people who do identify differently than what they were assigned at birth. So it really takes a lot of organization, activism, and work by people like Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera of the Stonewall uprising. You know, when it came to the culture of drag queens, that was sort of the place where you could express yourself if you were transgender. Now, the terminology back then, you know, you might say a drag queen and mean a trans person at that time, but nowadays, you know, you can perform drag and not necessarily be a transgender person. So there really is an evolution over time, but because of these, what I personally see as kind of inherited stigmas of what is it to be a man, what is it to be a woman, it takes time to shift, and with that time, when it's not there yet, you are going to be the most ostracized minority if you are a trans person, especially if you're a trans person of color. So it really does take quite a bit of time throughout the 70s and the 80s, 90s, when trans people are finally recognized, and you know, trans people are still facing a lot of prejudice, and it is a risk to be trans still. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in our understanding of gender identity and acceptance of those who have a different view of gender identity than the mainstream, perhaps. But as to why, I mean, that's probably a pretty loaded question, but yeah. I hope that I gave some kind of acceptable answer for
I mean,
you.
that comes down to individual people, and there's no way to try to figure out that combination.
Right. So we'll take one more question.
Can you touch on how queer went from an ugly word to one embraced by LGBTQ folks?
Oh, sure. So the question was, can we talk about how queer, the word queer, started out as more of a derogatory term and then became more accepted, and sort of took the gay community took the definition for their own meaning. Yeah, so queerness was, if someone was queer, then, I mean, you could probably associate it with weird, different, you know, it had this connotation of funny, different, not like us, other. So what has often happened within human rights campaigns and movements of all sorts, that these derogatory terms are then transformed and the people who are called queer take ownership of that word. And
like the pink triangle.
Yes, just like the pink triangle, like ACT UP used the pink triangle, so they're re-envisioning it. So queerness, this is a more modern term. Most of the, you know,
define modern.
Yes, modern, I would say, like, we're talking about early 2000s, or, you know, late 90s, you start to hear queer as something that is not a derogatory term, and it's more accepted as that, in general. So, and it's become a very useful term because, as you've probably noticed, we've started out with organizations that are for gays, organizations for lesbians, organizations for transgender people, but then it becomes, as everyone's organizing and coming together, it's LGBT, LGBTQ. Now there's LGBTQIA+. So because people are being, because it's more acceptable to explore sexuality and romantic relationships and other kinds of relationships, even platonic relationships, and sort of question what do we want out of those types of relationships? What do we want out of our community? And finding those niche groups has become a way to find community. So, for instance, folks who don't have any sexual attraction, they're known as asexual. So they have been able to, they have a term for that now. And having a term is so important because it gives you a sense of identity. So queerness became sort of an umbrella term. So when we say the queer community, that kind of includes everyone who identifies as some way not heterosexual or outside of that mainstream norm. Who knows how it will evolve further. There are new terms that I'm learning almost every day too, so in my research and everything. So it's really it continues to evolve, and I would say that the movement for human rights in general is always going to be evolving, and I think it's always going to be a fight that we got to participate in.
Hope not.
Well, I mean,
that's
I hope
that's
not
the goal,
either,
right?
But that is the goal. That is the goal. But
we'll
always activating people to fight for their individual rights, finding community. I mean, those are the things that I think are going to continue. And with that, this has been it's been a pleasure speaking with you all today. I do hope that we helped you have a nice introduction to LGBTQ history. If there were any questions that we didn't get to, please feel free to still type them in the chat, and I don't mind doing a follow-up as I will continue to do my own research, as this is just a fascinating topic, and do look out for future programs on this. Yeah. I also wanted to mention, for anyone who is new to the Northeast Georgia History Center, we have excellent digital programs, especially if you become a digital member. So our digital memberships are as low as $3 a month. You can even just pay $35 for the whole year, and you will get members-only live streams, members-only podcast episodes, video lessons. We are in the midst of this summer of curating a lot more content for our new digital membership. In fact, our next members-only program is going to be with Glenn this Friday about medieval illuminated manuscripts.
They're very pretty.
Yes, they are very pretty.
And they're so involved.
Yes.
Tune in to find out how much work went into one of those things.
Yes, so let me put up the information. I'll put up the information for y'all at the end, but if you just go to our website, www.negahc.org, you'll see our membership option, and we do hope that you will become members. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in a future program. We do hope. And yeah, thanks.
That's it. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
See you Friday, we hope.
Yeah.